My phone buzzed at midnight with 5 words that changed everything. Call me now. She's been lying. I sat up in bed, squinting at the screen. David Wilson, my lawyer for 15 years, had never texted me past business hours. Never used all caps. Never sounded panicked. I didn't call back immediately. I made coffee first, sat in Margaret's favorite chair, looked at her photo on the mantel, the one from our 40th anniversary, 2 months before the cancer diagnosis. Margaret always said I was too trusting. Bob, she'd whisper during family dinners, watching Rebecca fuss over the grandkids. Sometimes perfect is too perfect. I'd dismissed it as jealousy. Margaret had always been protective of our family's money, our legacy. Rebecca was young, beautiful, devoted. She'd held Margaret's hand during those final weeks, handled all the paperwork, made all the arrangements. But what my lawyer told me next would make me question everything I thought I knew about the woman who held my dying wife's hand. The call lasted 47 minutes. When David finished talking, I understood why Margaret had been so worried those final weeks. Bob, I need you to listen carefully, David had said, his voice tight. Rebecca submitted estate documents to my office yesterday. Documents I've never seen before. Documents that don't match anything in Margaret's actual will. I'd been handling Margaret's estate planning for 23 years. Every change, every amendment, every beneficiary update had crossed my desk. But according to David, Rebecca claimed to have a newer will, dated just 2 weeks before Margaret's death. She says Margaret wanted to simplify things for the family, David continued. Says Margaret was concerned about your emotional state after the diagnosis. My emotional state. That phrase would haunt me for months. Looking back, I should have seen the pattern earlier. How Rebecca had slowly, methodically, pushed me to the margins of my own wife's care. It started in March, right after the terminal diagnosis. Rebecca volunteered to handle Margaret's medical appointments. Dad, you shouldn't have to deal with all this stress, she'd said, rubbing my shoulder with that practiced sympathy. Let me take care of the logistics. She'd created a visitor schedule for Margaret's hospice room, color-coded, laminated, posted on the door. My own visiting hours were listed as 2 to 4 p.m., Tuesdays and Thursdays only. Margaret needs her rest, Rebecca explained when I questioned it. The doctors say too much stimulation isn't good for her condition. But Margaret had always been a social person. She'd hosted Sunday dinners for 42 years. She'd never wanted to limit family time, especially not with Emily and Jake, our grandkids. When I tried to visit outside my assigned hours, the hospice staff turned me away. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but Mrs. Miller-Thompson left strict instructions. She has medical power of attorney. Medical power of attorney. When had that happened? Rebecca had an explanation for everything. She carried a leather portfolio everywhere, expensive looking, probably $500, filled with official documents. Birth certificates, insurance forms, medical directives, always pulling out the right paper at the right moment. Margaret signed this last month, she'd say, producing another form I'd never seen. She wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. The medication schedule was Rebecca's creation, too. She'd convinced Margaret's doctor to adjust the pain management protocol. Mrs. Thompson is experiencing increased anxiety when family members visit, Rebecca had reported. Perhaps we could increase the anti-anxiety medication during social periods. I found out later that Margaret had been heavily sedated during most of my visits. Those final conversations when she seemed distant, confused, unable to focus, that wasn't the cancer. That was Rebecca managing my wife's consciousness. The financial isolation was more subtle. Rebecca convinced Margaret to consolidate everything for simplicity. The checking accounts, the savings, the investment portfolio, everything moved to a single account that required 2 signatures, Margaret's and Rebecca's. It's just easier this way, Dad, Rebecca explained during one of our Tuesday afternoon visits. Margaret doesn't want you worrying about bills and paperwork while you're grieving. Grieving, as if Margaret were already dead. Rebecca started handling the estate planning meetings too. Margaret finds these discussions upsetting, she'd tell David over the phone. We'll handle the details and bring Mr. Thompson up to speed later. Later never came. I tried to push back once. Called David directly to schedule a meeting about our retirement accounts. David seemed surprised. I thought Rebecca was coordinating all of this, he said. She told me you'd asked her to take over the legal logistics. Said you were too overwhelmed to make complex financial decisions right now. Too overwhelmed. Too emotional. Too grief-stricken. Rebecca's favorite phrases for describing my mental state. The visitor log at Millbrook Hospice told the real story. I requested a copy 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, ostensibly for insurance purposes. The log showed Rebecca visiting every single day, sometimes twice. Her visits lasted 4 to 6 hours. During those visits, she was alone with Margaret. My visits were recorded differently. Family visit supervised was stamped next to my name. Supervised by whom? I'd never noticed anyone watching our conversations, but Rebecca had been there, always in the corner, always with her portfolio, always taking notes. I like to keep track of Margaret's mood patterns, she'd explained when I asked about the notebook. The doctors find it helpful for medication adjustments. The night Margaret died, Rebecca was the one who called the family. Not the hospice staff, not the doctor. Rebecca. She went peacefully, Rebecca had whispered into the phone. She said she loved everyone and wanted you to take care of each other. But I never got to say goodbye. By the time I arrived at the hospice, Margaret was already gone. The room was already cleaned. Rebecca was already handling the arrangements. Margaret left very specific instructions about the funeral, Rebecca said, consulting her portfolio. She wanted everything simple, dignified. She didn't want you stressed about the details. Even in death, Margaret supposedly wanted to protect me from stress. The funeral cost $47,000. Margaret had always wanted a simple service. No flowers, no fancy casket, no reception. She'd made me promise years ago, when I go, just have the pastor say a few words and put me next to my mother. Instead, Rebecca arranged a full memorial service at Millbrook Presbyterian, catered reception for 200 people, professional videography, a marble headstone that cost more than my first car. Margaret changed her mind about simplicity, Rebecca explained. She wanted the family to have proper closure. But Margaret never mentioned any of this to me, and I'd never seen her signature on a single authorization form. The confrontation happened on a Thursday. I'd been building courage for 3 weeks, ever since David's midnight call. I had questions. Rebecca had answers. Time to see if they matched. I called her at 9:15 a.m., right after Daniel left for work. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Dad! How are you feeling today? I was just thinking about you." "Rebecca, I need to ask you about some paperwork." A pause. Just 2 seconds, but I caught it. "Of course. What kind of paperwork? I know all this legal stuff can be confusing." There it was, the subtle condescension. Margaret used to call it Rebecca's kindergarten teacher voice. Sweet, patient, slightly patronizing. "Margaret's will," I said simply. "David Wilson says you submitted a new version." Another pause, longer this time. "Oh, that. Yes, Margaret made some updates near the end. She was worried about, well, she wanted to make things easier for everyone." "Easier how?" "Dad, maybe we should talk about this in person. These financial matters can be complicated, and I know you're still processing your grief." "Rebecca." I kept my voice level, controlled. "What changes did Margaret make?" "Well, she was concerned about your emotional state. The doctors said grief can affect judgment, especially with complex financial decisions. Margaret wanted to make sure the estate was handled by someone with a clear head. Someone with a clear head, not her grieving husband of 43 years. Who has a clear head, Rebecca? Well, I have experience with estate planning, my degree in business administration, my work with Daniel's company finances. Margaret felt I was the logical choice to oversee things temporarily. Temporarily. That was a new word. "Rebecca, I've been handling our finances for 43 years. I managed our retirement planning, our investments, our insurance. What exactly am I too emotional to understand?" "Dad, this isn't about your capabilities. It's about Margaret's wishes. She specifically asked me to..." "Asked you to what?" "To protect the family assets during your grieving period. She was worried you might make impulsive decisions. Sell the house too quickly, liquidate investments at bad market timing. She wanted someone rational overseeing things. Rational. Another dig at my mental state. Show me the document." "What document?" "The will where Margaret gives you authority over our assets." Silence. I could hear Rebecca breathing. "Dad, I don't think you're in the right headspace to review complex legal documents. Maybe we should wait until..." Rebecca, I want to see my wife's will. Today. I understand you're frustrated, but Margaret made these decisions for good reasons. She loved you, but she also knew that grief can cloud judgment. She wanted to protect you from making mistakes you'd regret later. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Margaret had never once, in 43 years, suggested I couldn't handle financial decisions. Even during her illness, even while medicated, she'd always deferred to my judgment on money matters. What mistakes was Margaret worried about? Well, for instance, she knew you'd probably want to sell the Millbrook house quickly. Too many memories, too much maintenance for one person. But that property has significant appreciation potential. Selling now would be financially irresponsible. The Millbrook house, our family home for 38 years, where we'd raised Daniel, where Emily and Jake spent every Christmas morning. Margaret wanted to sell our house. She wanted to preserve its value for the grandchildren. The estate planning lawyer explained how property transfers work, how we could protect the asset from capital gains taxes, while ensuring your comfort during the transition period. The estate planning lawyer, not David Wilson apparently. What lawyer? David Mills. He specializes in complex estate transitions, much more experienced with these matters than David Wilson. I'd never heard of David Mills. Margaret had used David Wilson for every legal matter since 1998. Rebecca, who made the decision to change lawyers? Margaret did, obviously. She researched specialists in estate planning. David Mills came highly recommended. Recommended by whom? Another pause. By other families who'd been through similar transitions. Dad, I understand this is overwhelming, but Margaret spent months planning these arrangements. She wanted everything handled properly. Months. Margaret had been diagnosed in March, died in November. 8 months of illness, and apparently she'd spent that time completely restructuring our family's financial future without mentioning it to me once. Rebecca, I want David Mills's contact information. Dad, I really think you should talk to Daniel about this first. He understands the legal complexities. Maybe the three of us could meet this weekend and go through everything together. Daniel, my son who'd never shown interest in financial planning, who still asked me for advice about his own 401k contributions. Why does Daniel understand legal complexities I don't? Because he's not emotionally compromised right now. Dad, losing a spouse is traumatic. It affects cognitive function, decision-making ability. The grief counselor explained how important it is to avoid major financial decisions during the first year. Grief counselor. Another professional I'd never met. What grief counselor? The one Margaret arranged for you. Dr. Sarah Chen. She specializes in widow support. Margaret wanted to make sure you had professional help processing the loss. I took a slow breath, kept my voice steady. Rebecca, Margaret died 8 months ago. I haven't spoken to any grief counselor. Well, no, because you've been resistant to accepting help. Dr. Chen said that's normal. Older men often struggle with admitting they need emotional support. Older men, resistant, struggling, every word calculated to diminish, to infantilize, to position me as incapable. Rebecca, I'm going to ask you one more time. I want to see Margaret's will. I want David Mills's contact information. And I want copies of every document you claim Margaret signed. Dad, I understand you're upset, but Margaret left very specific instructions about protecting you from additional stress during this difficult time. Maybe when you're feeling more stable. I hung up. Margaret had been right. Sometimes perfect is too perfect. I didn't call Rebecca back. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call David Wilson. Instead, I called someone Margaret had always trusted more than lawyers, her sister Janet. Bob? You sound terrible. What's wrong? Janet, I need to ask you about Margaret's final weeks, about conversations you might have had with her. Of course. What specifically? Did Margaret ever mention changing our will? Giving Rebecca authority over our finances? Silence stretched across the phone line. Bob, Margaret was worried sick about Rebecca. My chest tightened. Worried how? She thought Rebecca was managing things too aggressively, taking over decisions that weren't hers to make. Margaret asked me twice if I thought Rebecca might be positioning herself for something. Positioning herself for what? Money, Bob. Margaret wasn't stupid. She saw how Rebecca paid attention to every financial conversation, how she always volunteered to handle paperwork, how she started excluding you from medical appointments. I sat down heavily in Margaret's chair. Did Margaret ever mention a lawyer named David Mills? Never. She always said David Wilson was the only lawyer she trusted. Said she'd never switch because David knew our whole financial history. Did she mention changing the will? Bob, 3 weeks before she died, Margaret called me at midnight. She was upset, confused about some papers Rebecca had brought her to sign. Said they looked important, but Rebecca wouldn't let her call you to review them first. What kind of papers? Legal documents. Rebecca told her they were medical forms, but Margaret said they looked more complicated than that. She asked Rebecca to wait until you could look at them together, and Rebecca got angry, said Margaret was being paranoid, that grief was making you unstable. Unstable. Rebecca's favorite diagnosis. What did Margaret do? She refused to sign them that night. But Bob, she was heavily medicated. The pain medication, the anti-anxiety pills. Her judgment was compromised. I think Rebecca wore her down over time. I closed my eyes. Janet, I think Rebecca forged Margaret's signature on estate documents. I think so too, but Bob, you need proof. Rebecca's smart. Whatever she did, she covered her tracks. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls that changed everything. The first was to Michael Torres, a private investigator David Wilson had recommended for a client divorce case years earlier. I hired him on the spot. $5,000 to investigate Rebecca's financial activities over the past year. The second was to Patricia Hayes, a forensic accountant who specialized in estate fraud. Another $5,000 for a complete audit of our family's financial records. The third was to Dr. James Morrison, Margaret's primary care physician. Dr. Morrison, I need to understand Margaret's mental state during her final weeks. Was she competent to make legal decisions? Mr. Mo Thompson, your wife was cognitively sharp until the final 72 hours. The pain medication and anti-anxiety drugs would have affected her energy levels, but not her judgment or decision-making ability. Did Rebecca ever report concerns about Margaret's mental state? Mrs. Miller Thompson called several times, asking me to increase your wife's anti-anxiety medication. She claimed Mrs. Thompson was becoming agitated during family visits. Was Margaret agitated during visits? Not when I observed her, no. She seemed most comfortable when you were present, most alert, most engaged. Did you increase the medication? At Mrs. Miller Thompson's request, yes. She had medical power of attorney. The document I'd never seen Margaret sign. That evening, I canceled the family dinner Rebecca had planned for Sunday. I told Daniel I wasn't feeling well, needed more time to process Margaret's death. Dad, Rebecca thinks you might benefit from talking to someone, a professional. Rebecca's been suggesting that a lot lately. She's worried about you. We all are. Daniel, did your mother ever mention wanting to change our will? What? No, never. Why would she? Did she ever mention feeling uncomfortable with Rebecca handling her medical care? A long pause. Dad, Mom did ask me once if I thought Rebecca was being too controlling, but I thought she was just stressed about the illness. What exactly did she say? She said Rebecca wouldn't let her make any decisions without consulting her first. Wouldn't let her see visitors Rebecca hadn't approved. Mom said she felt like a child in her own life. I hung up and sat in Margaret's chair until midnight, thinking about power of attorney documents I'd never authorized, wills I'd never seen, and lawyers I'd never hired. Margaret had tried to warn me. Even drugged, even dying, she'd tried to protect our family from Rebecca's plans. Tomorrow I'd start fighting back. Michael Torres called me on Monday morning with his first report. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you about some financial transactions from November. Did you authorize the sale of property at 847 Millbrook Lane? My hands went cold. What property sale? Your house, sir. According to county records, the property was sold on November 15th for $847,000. The proceeds went to an account under Rebecca Miller Thompson's name. November 15th, 1 week after Margaret's funeral. Michael, that's impossible. I live in that house. I've lived there for 38 years. Sir, I'm looking at the deed transfer right now. It shows Margaret Thompson's signature transferring ownership to Rebecca Miller Thompson on October 30th. Then Rebecca's signature selling to Millbrook Development Corporation on November 15th. October 30th. Margaret died November 8th. According to these documents, she'd transferred our house to Rebecca 9 days before her death. Michael, I need you to get me copies of every document in that transaction. Already ordered them. Mr. Thompson, there's something else. Rebecca purchased a property in Myrtle Beach on November 20th. $450,000. Cash. 5 days after selling my house, Rebecca bought herself a beach condo. Send me everything you have. I hung up and called Patricia Hayes. Patricia, I need you to examine some property documents. I think my daughter-in-law forged my wife's signature. Mr. Thompson, if you're right, that's felony fraud. Are you prepared for the legal implications? I'm prepared for the truth. The documents arrived Wednesday morning. I spread them across the dining room table, the same table where Margaret and I had signed our actual will 15 years earlier. The signature was wrong. Margaret had beautiful handwriting, elegant and consistent. She'd always signed her full name, Margaret Elizabeth Thompson. These documents showed Monsieur Thompson in shaky, uneven letters. But the forgery wasn't the most shocking discovery. The property deed showed Margaret transferring the house to Rebecca for $1 and other valuable consideration. What valuable consideration? What had Rebecca given Margaret in exchange for our home? The answer was in Patricia's preliminary financial audit. Mr. Thompson, I've identified 47 separate transactions totaling $2,800,000 transferred from your family accounts to accounts controlled by Rebecca Miller Thompson. 47 transactions. She hadn't stolen our money in one dramatic heist. She'd bled us slowly, systematically, over 8 months. The transfers began in March, right after your wife's diagnosis, Patricia continued. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. The amounts increased over time. The largest single transfer was $156,000 on November 12th. November 12th, 4 days after Margaret's funeral. Patricia, did I authorize any of these transfers? According to the bank records, all transfers were authorized by Margaret Thompson and Rebecca Miller Thompson under a joint account management agreement dated March 18th. March 18th, 10 days after Margaret's diagnosis. I never signed any joint account agreement. Mr. Thompson, your signature isn't on these documents, only your wife's and Rebecca's. That evening, I decided to test Rebecca's confidence. Daniel and Rebecca came for dinner Thursday, bringing Emily and Jake. Rebecca had suggested the visit, claiming concern about my isolation patterns. Over Margaret's famous pot roast recipe, I mentioned the house casually. Rebecca, I've been thinking about what you said, about Margaret wanting to preserve the house's value. Rebecca's fork paused halfway to her mouth, just for a second. Oh? What specifically? Well, I was looking at recent property sales in the neighborhood. The Hendersons sold for $847,000 last month. Interesting number. Rebecca set down her fork. Dad, I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, just noting that our house would probably sell for a similar amount if someone wanted to buy it. Why would anyone want to buy it? I smiled. Margaret's patient, knowing smile. Oh, I don't know. Investment purposes, maybe. Daniel looked confused. Dad, are you thinking about selling? You never mentioned. I'm just exploring options, I said, watching Rebecca's face, making sure I understand all the possibilities. Rebecca had gone pale. Dad, I think we should talk about this privately. These kinds of decisions shouldn't be made impulsively. What's impulsive about understanding my options? You're not thinking clearly. Major financial decisions during grief. Rebecca, I interrupted gently, I'm 64 years old. I've been making financial decisions since before you were born. I think I can handle exploring my options. Emily and Jake were coloring at the other end of the table, but Daniel was listening intently. Dad, what's really going on? Rebecca shot him a sharp look. Daniel, your father is processing grief. Sometimes that creates confusion about financial matters. Rebecca, I said, my voice still calm, still patient, I'm curious about something. If Margaret wanted to preserve the house's value for the grandchildren, how exactly would that work? What do you mean? Well, if the house is in my name and I die, it goes to Daniel and the kids anyway. What value preservation was Margaret worried about? Rebecca's hands were trembling slightly. Tax implications. Estate taxes can be substantial with properties over certain values. Our estate isn't large enough for federal estate taxes. State taxes, then. Connecticut has different rules. I nodded thoughtfully. I should probably talk to a tax attorney about this. Get professional advice. That's not necessary. I already researched. Rebecca, I think I'm capable of consulting my own professionals. The room went quiet except for Emily's crayons on paper. Dad, Daniel said slowly, what aren't you telling us? I looked at my son, then at Rebecca, then back at Daniel. I'm telling you that I'm going to take a very close look at our family's finances. Make sure I understand exactly what Margaret wanted. Make sure everything is exactly as it should be. Rebecca stood up abruptly. I think we should go. But we haven't had dessert, Emily protested. We'll have dessert at home, Rebecca said, already gathering her purse. After they left, I sat in Margaret's chair and smiled. Rebecca had just confirmed she had something to hide. Rebecca came back alone on Saturday morning. No Daniel, no kids, just her and her expensive leather portfolio. Dad, we need to talk. I'd been expecting this visit. Of course. Coffee? This isn't a social call. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where she'd helped Margaret with her medication schedule, where she'd brought those mysterious papers for Margaret to sign. I'm concerned about Thursday night, she began. Your comments about the house, about consulting attorneys. Daniel is worried you're becoming paranoid. Paranoid. Another clinical diagnosis. I'm becoming careful, Rebecca. There's a difference. Dad, I understand grief manifests in different ways. Sometimes it creates suspicion, distrust of people who are trying to help. Who's trying to help? I am. I've been trying to help since Margaret got sick. Managing her care, handling the paperwork, protecting you from additional stress. By selling my house? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, then something harder. What are you talking about? $847,000, Rebecca, November 15th. Millbrook Development Corporation. She stared at me for a long moment. I have no idea what you're referring to. Property deed transfer. Margaret Thompson to Rebecca Miller Thompson, October 30th. Rebecca Miller Thompson to Millbrook Development Corporation, November 15th. Dad, that's not possible. Patricia Hayes thinks it's very possible. She's a forensic accountant. Rebecca's composure cracked. You hired an accountant? To investigate what? To investigate 47 unauthorized transfers totaling $2,800,000 from Margaret's accounts to accounts controlled by you. Those transfers were authorized, Margaret signed. Margaret signed what, Rebecca? She realized her mistake immediately. I mean, if there were transfers, they would have been authorized. Margaret handled all the financial planning near the end. While heavily medicated, she was competent to make decisions. About giving you power of attorney? I already had power of attorney. Since when? Another pause. Rebecca was calculating, trying to remember which lies she'd told to whom. Since March, when Margaret got sick. I never signed any power of attorney authorization. You weren't required to. Margaret could grant medical power of attorney independently. Financial power of attorney requires both spouses to consent. Not if the primary account holder is deemed unable to participate in complex financial decisions. There it was, the heart of Rebecca's strategy. Deemed by whom? By medical professionals. Dr. Chen documented your compromised emotional state. The grief counselor I never met? Rebecca went very still. You've been seeing Dr. Chen since November. Rebecca, I've never spoken to anyone named Dr. Chen. You must have forgotten. Grief affects memory. My memory is fine, my bank records are fine, my signature analysis is fine. What's not fine is my daughter-in-law forging my dead wife's signature on legal documents. I never forged anything. Then explain the handwriting analysis. What handwriting analysis? The one that shows Margaret's signature on 47 documents was written by someone else. Rebecca stood up abruptly, clutching her portfolio. Dad, you're clearly not well. This paranoia, these accusations, Daniel needs to know how bad this has gotten. Daniel already knows. Knows what? That I've hired a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and a criminal attorney specializing in elder fraud. Rebecca's face went white. You're threatening me? I'm protecting myself. Margaret tried to warn me. She told Janet you were pressuring her to sign documents she didn't understand. That's a lie. Janet's willing to testify. Testify to what? To Margaret's midnight phone call 3 weeks before she died. To Margaret's concerns about papers you brought her. To Margaret's request that you wait for me to review them. Rebecca backed toward the door. This is insane. You're having some kind of breakdown. Rebecca, you have 48 hours to return Margaret's property to Margaret's rightful heirs. Or what? I smiled Margaret's patient smile. Or Sunday's family dinner is going to be very interesting. She left without another word. Rebecca's counterattack began within hours. My phone started ringing at 3 p.m. Daniel first, then Margaret's cousin Sarah, then our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. Rebecca had been busy. Dad, Rebecca is really worried about you, Daniel said. She thinks you might be having some kind of mental health crisis. What kind of crisis? Paranoid delusions. She said you accused her of stealing money, forging documents. Dad, that's not like you. What if it's true? It's not true. Rebecca's been nothing but helpful since Mom died. She handled everything when you were too grief-stricken to function. Too grief-stricken to function. Rebecca's narrative was spreading. Margaret's cousin Sarah was more direct. Bob, Rebecca called me. She's concerned you're developing dementia. She said you hired investigators to follow her, that you're making wild accusations about financial impropriety. Sarah, did Margaret ever mention concerns about Rebecca? Well, Margaret did say Rebecca was very controlling about her medical care, but we all thought it was for the best. You were so devastated by the diagnosis. So devastated, so grief-stricken, so unable to function. Rebecca had been planting this narrative for months. Mrs. Patterson called that evening. Bob, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I've been worried about you since Margaret passed. You've seemed so isolated, so confused about basic things. What basic things? Well, Rebecca mentioned you've been forgetting important appointments, missing bill payments. She said she's been helping you manage daily tasks, bill payments. I'd been paying our bills without assistance for 43 years. Mrs. Patterson, has Rebecca been discussing my personal business with you regularly? Oh, just out of concern. She's such a devoted daughter-in-law. She mentioned she's been handling your financial matters to prevent any mistakes during this difficult time. Rebecca had spent months positioning herself as my caregiver, me as her incompetent patient. The social media campaign was subtler, but effective. Rebecca's Facebook page showed a carefully curated story of family devotion, photos of her bringing me groceries, organizing Margaret's medication, sitting by Margaret's bedside. The captions were masterful, grateful to help Dad navigate this difficult time. Grief affects everyone differently, and patience is so important. Some days are harder than others for Dad. Family support makes all the difference during mental health struggles. Taking care of Dad's financial paperwork today. Amazing how overwhelming simple tasks can become during depression. Mental health struggles, depression, overwhelming simple tasks. She'd created a digital record of my supposed incompetence. The family group text was more direct. I'm worried about Bob's recent behavior. He's become suspicious of family members trying to help him. Maybe it's time to consider professional intervention. Professional intervention. Code for declaring me mentally incompetent. But Rebecca made a crucial mistake. She copied David Wilson on an email meant only for family members. The subject line read, Dad's declining mental state? Legal options? David forwarded it to me immediately with a note. Bob, I think you need to see this. The email laid out Rebecca's complete strategy. David has become increasingly paranoid and delusional since Margaret's death. He's making wild accusations about financial impropriety and document forgery. I think he may need to be declared mentally incompetent for his own protection. What legal steps would be required to assume guardianship over his affairs? Guardianship. Rebecca wanted legal control over my entire life. But the email also revealed something else. Rebecca had been consulting with another lawyer, David Mills, the estate planning specialist she'd mentioned. The email was copied to deills@estateplanning.com. I forwarded Rebecca's email to Patricia Hayes and Michael Torres. Patricia called back within an hour. Mr. Thompson, this email is evidence of conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Rebecca's been planning to have you declared incompetent so she could maintain control over the stolen assets. Can you prove that? Combined with the financial evidence and the forged documents? Absolutely. She's been building a case against your mental competency while simultaneously stealing your assets. It's a classic elder fraud pattern. Michael Torres had even better news. Mr. Thompson, I've been investigating David Mills. His license was suspended last year for falsifying estate documents. He's currently under investigation by the Connecticut Bar Association for running an estate fraud scheme targeting elderly widows. Rebecca's been working with a disbarred lawyer. Gets better. I found 3 other families in Connecticut who lost money in similar schemes. Same pattern: concerned family member gains power of attorney. Works with David Mills to create fraudulent estate documents. Elderly victim gets declared incompetent when they start asking questions. How much money? Total? $8.4 million across the 4 families. Rebecca wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was part of an organized fraud ring. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Sunday's family dinner was going to be more than interesting. It was going to be a justice. I spent Saturday morning organizing everything into what Patricia called prosecutorial presentation order. The dining room table, Margaret's mahogany table where we'd hosted 42 Christmas dinners, became my evidence laboratory. Timeline first. A white poster board with dates in red ink. March 8th, 2023. Margaret's diagnosis. March 18th, 2023. First joint account agreement. Rebecca obtains financial access. March 22nd, 2023. First suspicious transfer, $5,000. October 30th, 2023. House deed transfer while Margaret dying. November 8th, 2023. Margaret's death. November 12th, 2023. Largest transfer, 100 demos, 56,000, 4 days after funeral. November 15th, 2023. House sale completion, 800 demo and 47,000, November 20th, 2023. Rebecca's Myrtle Beach purchase, 400 demo and 50,000, 8 months, 47 transactions, $2.8 million. The signature analysis came back Friday afternoon. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, certified forensic document examiner, had compared Margaret's signatures from 15 years of banking records against the estate documents Rebecca submitted. Her conclusion was devastating. The questioned signatures attributed to Margaret Thompson show significant variation from known exemplars. Stroke patterns, pressure points, and letter formation are inconsistent with Mrs. Thompson's established handwriting characteristics. In my professional opinion, these signatures were created by a different person, attempting to replicate Mrs. Thompson's handwriting. Translation: Rebecca had forged every single document. The medical records painted an even darker picture. Dr. James Morrison provided Margaret's complete medication log. During Rebecca's visits, Margaret's anti-anxiety medication was increased 6 times always. At Rebecca's request, always claiming I was causing Margaret stress. Mrs. Thompson was essentially sedated during the period these documents were allegedly signed, Dr. Morrison wrote. Her cognitive capacity during Rebecca Miller Thompson's solo visits would have been significantly compromised. Rebecca had drugged Margaret into compliance. The bank records showed surgical precision. Patricia Hayes had traced every dollar. The theft occurred in 3 phases, she explained over the phone. Phase 1. Establish access through fraudulent power of attorney. Phase 2, small transfers to test the system. Phase 3, accelerated drainage once the victim died. But the most damning evidence was Rebecca's own digital trail. Michael Torres had obtained Rebecca's credit card records, cell phone data, and internet search history through legal discovery requests. Her search history told the complete story. February 15th, 2023. How to obtain power of attorney, elderly parent. February 22nd, 2023. Forging signatures, legal consequences. March 5th, 2023. Estate planning lawyers, Connecticut. March 12th, 2023. Terminal cancer, timeline average. August 18th, 2023. When can elderly person be declared incompetent? October 25, 2023. Property transfer without spouse consent. November 10th, 2023. Statute of limitations, estate fraud. She'd been researching fraud techniques before Margaret was even diagnosed. The David Mills connection confirmed organized crime. Federal investigators had identified a network of corrupted lawyers, medical professionals, and family insiders targeting elderly widows across Connecticut and Massachusetts. The scheme was sophisticated. Identify vulnerable elderly targets, plant an insider, often a family member, gradually isolate the victim, obtain fraudulent power of attorney, systematically drain assets, then have the victim declared incompetent if they objected. Rebecca wasn't acting alone. She was part of a criminal enterprise. The financial accounting was precise. Stolen assets. Primary residence, $847,000. Investment accounts, $1,247,000. Savings accounts, $456,000. Life insurance payout, $250,000. Total, $2,800,000. Rebecca's purchases using stolen funds. Myrtle Beach condo, $450,000. Mercedes, E-Class, $67,000. Designer clothing/jewelry, $23,000. Living expenses, $89,000. David Mills, legal fees, $156,000. Remaining in accounts, $2,015,000. She'd stolen nearly $3 million and spent it like lottery winnings. But Patricia had discovered something even more valuable than money: witnesses. Janet Thompson wasn't the only family member who'd noticed problems. Margaret's nurse, Linda Rodriguez, remembered uncomfortable interactions with Rebecca. Mrs. Miller Thompson would arrive with legal documents. Wait until Mr. Thompson left, then pressure Mrs. Thompson to sign papers. Mrs. Thompson would ask to wait for her husband, and Mrs. Miller Thompson would become agitated, claiming time was running out. The hospice social worker, Karen Mills, had documented concerns about Rebecca's controlling behavior. Mrs. Miller Thompson restricted visitor access, controlled medication timing, and insisted on being present for all medical consultations. This pattern raised red flags for potential elder abuse. Even Daniel was starting to remember troubling conversations. Mom did ask me once if I thought Rebecca was being too aggressive about handling things, he admitted when I called him Friday evening. She said Rebecca wouldn't let her make any decisions without consulting her first. The evidence was overwhelming, systematic, irrefutable. Tomorrow's family dinner would have 43 attendees. Everyone Margaret had loved, everyone Rebecca had lied to. They deserved to know the truth about the woman who'd held Margaret's hand while robbing her children's future. Sunday arrived gray and cold, the kind of Connecticut March day Margaret had always said was perfect for family gatherings. Everyone together, nowhere else to go. I'd invited 43 people to Margaret's memorial dinner. Extended family, close friends, neighbors who'd known us for decades. The kind of crowd that would make private conversation impossible and public accountability unavoidable. Rebecca arrived early, of course, always helpful, always controlling the narrative. "Dad, this is wonderful that you're finally ready to have people over," she said, carrying in covered dishes. "Margaret would be so happy to see the family together." She was wearing Margaret's pearl necklace, the one that had been missing from the jewelry box. Daniel and the kids came next, then Margaret's sister Janet, then waves of cousins, neighbors, and friends. By 2 p.m., the house was full of voices, laughter, and the smell of Margaret's famous recipes that Rebecca had somehow obtained. Rebecca moved through the crowd like a campaign candidate, touching shoulders, accepting condolences, sharing carefully edited memories of Margaret's final weeks. "She was so brave," Rebecca told Mrs. Patterson, so concerned about Bob's well-being. "She spent her last weeks making sure everything was organized for his future. Such a devoted daughter-in-law," whispered Margaret's cousin Sarah. "Bob is so lucky to have family support during this difficult time." Rebecca had positioned herself perfectly. The devoted caregiver, the responsible family member, the patient saint dealing with my grief-induced instability. At 3:30, I called for attention. "Thank you all for coming to remember Margaret," I began, standing at the head of the dining room table. "She would have loved seeing everyone together in this house she treasured." Nods, smiles, raised glasses. Rebecca beamed from her position near the kitchen, surrounded by family members she'd charmed over 8 months of careful manipulation. Margaret was many things: loving wife, devoted mother, protective grandmother, but above all, she was honest. She valued truth, even when truth was difficult. The room grew quieter. So today, in Margaret's memory, I want to share some truths about her final months. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. Margaret died believing her family would be taken care of, that her grandchildren would inherit the home she'd protected for 38 years, that the money she and I saved for 43 years would provide security for the people she loved. I reached for the first document, but Margaret was deceived. The room went silent. On March 18th, while Margaret was still processing her cancer diagnosis, someone convinced her to sign financial documents giving them access to our accounts. I held up the forged power of attorney. Except Margaret never signed these documents. According to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, certified forensic document examiner, these signatures were forged by someone else. Gasps around the room. Rebecca had gone pale. "Dad, what are you doing?" Daniel asked. "I'm honoring your mother's devotion to truth." I picked up the timeline chart. Between March and November, someone made 47 unauthorized transfers from Margaret's accounts. Total amount, $2,800,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. On October 30th, 9 days before Margaret died, someone forged her signature transferring ownership of this house, our family home, to themselves. I looked directly at Rebecca. On November 15th, 1 week after Margaret's funeral, that someone sold this house for $847,000. Rebecca stood up abruptly. "This is insane. Bob is having some kind of breakdown." "Rebecca, please sit down. I'm not finished." The authority in my voice surprised even me. Margaret's authority. On November 20th, 5 days after selling my house, someone purchased a vacation home in Myrtle Beach for $450,000. Cash. I held up the property records. Rebecca Miller Thompson, your daughter-in-law, the woman you've all been praising for her devotion to family. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, people standing to get a better view of the documents I was displaying. "She's lying!" Rebecca shouted. "Bob is delusional. He's been making wild accusations for weeks." "Rebecca, are you claiming you didn't purchase property in Myrtle Beach?" That's not... Those are legitimate investments." "Legitimate investments using money stolen from my dying wife?" Daniel stood up, his face white with shock. "Rebecca, is this true?" "Daniel, your father is sick. He needs professional help." "Answer the question," Janet said sharply. "Did you take money from Margaret's accounts?" "I had legal authority to manage the estate." "Legal authority based on forged documents," I interrupted, holding up the signature analysis. "Dr. Morrison's report confirms that Margaret never signed a single one of these authorizations." Rebecca's composure finally cracked. Margaret was dying. Someone had to make responsible decisions. Bob was too emotional, too unstable to notice you drugging my wife. I held up Dr. Morrison's medical report. Margaret's anti-anxiety medication was increased 6 times during your visits. You told her doctor that I was causing her stress, that she needed to be sedated during family visits. That was medical necessity. Medical necessity to keep her unconscious while you forged her signature? I never forged anything. The lie hung in the air, obvious to everyone. Margaret's cousin Tom, a retired police officer, stepped forward. "Rebecca, do you want to explain how Margaret's pearls ended up around your neck?" Rebecca's hand flew to the necklace. "Margaret gave them to me." "When?" I asked Scarlett. "Because Margaret told Janet 3 weeks before she died that she wanted Emily to have those pearls on her 16th birthday." Emily, now 11, stared at Rebecca with wide, confused eyes. "She wanted me to keep them safe." "Like you kept her money safe?" Daniel's voice was ice. The room had turned into a tribunal. 43 people who'd loved Margaret, all staring at the woman who'd betrayed her trust. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "you held my dying wife's hand while planning to rob her children's future. You sedated her, isolated her, and forged her signature on documents that stole everything she'd worked for. That's not true. You were part of a criminal network. David Mills, the lawyer you hired, is under federal investigation for estate fraud. You're not Margaret's devoted caregiver. You're a professional criminal." Rebecca backed toward the door, but Margaret's family had surrounded her. "Where's our money, Rebecca?" Daniel demanded. "Daniel, please, you have to believe me." "I believe the evidence," he said. "I believe the FBI agents who called me yesterday." Rebecca's face went white. "That's right," I continued. "Federal investigators have been tracking David Mills's fraud network for 18 months. They have your search history, your financial records, and testimony from 3 other families you've robbed. I want a lawyer. You can call one from jail, Tom said, pulling out his phone. I'm calling the state police. Rebecca made a run for the door, but she didn't get far. Connecticut State Police Detective Maria Santos was waiting on the front porch with an arrest warrant. As they led Rebecca away in handcuffs, she turned back toward the house. You'll never prove anything. Margaret wanted me to have that money. Detective Santos paused. Ma'am, we have recordings of Margaret Thompson expressing concerns about your behavior to multiple family members. We have medical records showing systematic sedation during document signings. We have forensic evidence of signature forgery. And we have your own internet search history documenting premeditated fraud. Rebecca's last words before the police car door closed were directed at me. This isn't over. But it was. Margaret's family surrounded me on the front porch, watching Justice drive away in a state police cruiser. Dad, Daniel said, putting his arm around my shoulders. I'm sorry. I should have listened. Margaret tried to warn us, Janet added. We all should have listened. I looked at the house Margaret had loved, the family she'd protected, the truth she'd valued above all else. She's listening now, I said. Rebecca Miller Thompson was arraigned on 14 federal charges 3 days later. Elder abuse, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering. The bail hearing was brief. Rebecca's lawyer, not David Mills, who was already in federal custody, argued that she was a devoted family member who'd made accounting errors during a difficult time. Judge Patricia Reynolds wasn't buying it. Miss Miller Thompson, the evidence suggests systematic exploitation of a vulnerable elderly person over an 8-month period. The court finds you a flight risk given the substantial assets you've concealed. Bail denied. Rebecca would wait for trial in federal detention. The asset recovery moved quickly. Patricia Hayes had traced every dollar, every transaction, every hidden account. Within 2 weeks, the court had frozen Rebecca's assets and begun the process of returning Margaret's money to her rightful heirs. The Myrtle Beach condo was sold. The Mercedes was repossessed. The designer clothes and jewelry were liquidated. $2,100,000 was recovered and transferred back to Margaret's estate. Daniel's divorce was finalized in record time. Rebecca's criminal charges provided grounds for immediate dissolution, with full custody of Emily and Jake granted to Daniel. The children moved back into the Millbrook house with me. Margaret's home was whole again. David Mills pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and received 7 years in prison. His cooperation led to the arrest of 6 additional conspirators in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. The elder fraud network Rebecca had joined was completely dismantled. But the most important change was subtler. Our family now operates with what Janet calls Margaret's transparency rules. Quote, all financial decisions require 2 family members' review. All legal documents are examined by independent counsel. All major changes require family discussion. No one person ever again controls another person's future. Emily and Jake understand, in age-appropriate terms, that their mother made serious mistakes and hurt people they loved. They'll grow up knowing that actions have consequences, that trust must be earned, and that family means protecting each other. Margaret's pearls are in a safety deposit box, waiting for Emily's 16th birthday. The memorial dinner is now an annual tradition. Every March, Margaret's family gathers to remember her devotion to truth, her protection of those she loved, and her final gift to us all, the courage to demand justice. Rebecca is eligible for parole in 2029. Margaret's legacy is forever.